Great to be here, and thank you for the introduction there. I'm glad that you tried our service. We're gradually expanding out of London. We're operating in 12 countries today, but London we're gradually getting further and further out, which is great to see. I want to share with you some of my experience over the last, I suppose it's more than 10 years now, across these three different companies, of how we set about building, scaling, and getting a sort of data analytics team to have serious impact in these businesses. And just to give a little bit of context to start with, so the sort of unique thing about Ocado is obviously it kind of does everything. It's got the warehousing, it's got the logistics, it's got crazy amounts of automation, it's obviously got website and apps and those kind of things as well. It's building its own robotics. So it's got an incredibly rich, probably pretty unique diversity of data. Where every single customer's product is in the warehouse, what box it went into, and who put it in there, and who the driver was, all of these sorts of things. Tremendous diversity of data. Really, really rich stuff. So great opportunities there, but it's kind of where do you get started? And I'll give you a nice example of where we got started there in a moment. King is obviously a purely digital business. And took over the world of gaming back in 2012, 2013 with Candy Crush in particular. And that company grew from just while I was there, from just a few million customers to around 350 million customers over a very short space of time. So we had some very interesting scaling difficulties there. Spent a long time running just to sort of stand still, really. And along the way, grew a data and analytics team from about 5 people to close to 200, which is getting on for 10% of the business. And that's those people. There was constant demand for more of what those people could provide to the business. So I want to give you a flavour for how. For what those people were doing, and also for how we structured it, because that was obviously a very large team. And we learned a lot about how not to structure such teams along the way. So there's a lot to be shared there. And then finally, Deliveroo. I've only been with Deliveroo for a short time, but Deliveroo is another business that's growing at a crazy rate, more than 600% growth last year, and a data and analytics team that's somewhere in the region of 30 or 40 people today, and will probably be doubling this year. But that's far less than the 10% of the business that King operates at. But that's typical, I would say, of a business that has a lot of real-world operations, where you need a lot more people on the ground, which a purely digital business like King obviously doesn't need. Okay, so let me take you through an example maybe to set the scene a bit, and then I want to take you through the sort of 3 major themes that I want to talk about today. So the example is one that many of you will be familiar with, if not from Ocado, then from a similar organization. So it's the checkout process. So Ocado, when you go through your shop and you've put typically 40 or 50 items into your basket and you want to check out, puts various pages in your way, which is in complete contrast to, say, a company like Amazon, where once you hit that checkout button, you're on a very one-directional funnel where the number of links to allow you to do anything else except proceed is basically 0. So Ocado, there's loads of links to let you do other sorts of things, and there's lots of extra products that they want you to put into your basket. And I'm not going to talk about the algorithms for what was recommended and suggested there, but we did tremendous things in that area of recommending the kind of products that you would want. But the whole checkout process was viewed inside Ocado as a little bit of a two-edged sword. Clearly, the more things that we suggested and recommended to you, the more stuff you ended up putting into your basket. But there was a great it was very clear that many customers did not like the process. despite the fact that those same customers did buy several products from the checkout walk. So it was clearly of use to them, but also something that they didn't really appreciate. So we tracked very, very closely exactly what was going on in that checkout process. And this was where it was absolutely essential, therefore, to have very, very fine-grained data of every single page of that process, exactly what products were shown, what the customer investigated, clicked on, did or did not add to the basket, and what that led to, obviously, in terms of drop-off from that funnel, and also the revenue implications of each individual page. And what we discovered was, the most interesting thing there that we discovered was a great surprise. So the last page in the process where you're about to check out and we show you, here's your whole basket of stuff. That page was actually revenue negative. So your customer looks at that page and they say, oh shit, there's all this stuff I've got, let me remove a few things from my basket. So that leads to a little bit of a dilemma there. Do we want to hide this page? Do we want to kind of maybe push the items down a bit so they can't see so many? It's half below the fold. What do we do? But actually, because we had the fine-grained data of every single customer's individual journey, we were able to dig a bit deeper into what was going on there. And as we investigated, we saw that actually what was happening on that page was not at all what we expected, and in fact, not at all what I just described. It wasn't customers, in aggregate at least, saying, oh shit, I've got too much in my basket, let me remove stuff. What customers were doing was actually, when they saw that page, they were being reminded of other things that they might want, or some change to what they might want, and they were going back into the shop, so they were abandoning the checkout funnel, going back into the shop, buying other stuff, and indeed, they were removing a few things on that page. So that page, when viewed in isolation, was revenue negative. But when viewed in the context of actually the journey that they were on, it was actually revenue positive. And so it was just triggering, actually seeing that whole basket was actually triggering people to buy other things. So that was a sort of great realization that if we hadn't had that kind of fine-grained data and had the sort of scientific discipline of trying to really follow what was going on at each stage and what was going on in the customer's mind, we would have probably ended up making the wrong decision there. So that's the sort of thing where you need to have the right people, the right data, the right systems. We had some pretty good systems in place for actually doing that kind of data exploration. And if any of those three ingredients had not been there, we wouldn't have discovered the right thing to do. I'm going to click here. All right, so three courses to today. It's going to be food themed since I'm from Deliveroo. So the starter is about building a team. The main course, the most important piece, about getting impact, and then finally the dessert about scaling. So let's start off on our starter. So building a data-centric business. There's three main ingredients that I want to talk about here that need to come together, which I just mentioned a moment ago. Let's hope you can just about see that. So the three ingredients are people, data, and systems. So let's maybe start with the top of those three, people. So there's a lot of buzz around data scientists and how it's kind of the sexiest job of the 21st century and all this kind of stuff, and that's all great. But really what I'd like to say is that actually the term data scientist is in many ways not a helpful one. You don't so much want people who are scientists about data. You want people who are scientists about your business and product and customer. And that is the field of study that they're an expert in. A physicist is an expert in some portion of nature. The scientist you want is a scientist who's an expert in your business and your customer. And that's what they really want to understand. They want to really understand how that works, how your product works, how your customer works, how they can influence things. And data is a tool. Data is the tool that helps them do that. But data is not the thing that they study. And so for that reason, the people that you want to hire in this area are people who have an ability to to get to terms with and understand your business and product and customer. They're not the sort of lab coat scientist who sits in the corner and works on their own. And so that's an absolutely essential ingredient that I want to stress with that. Okay, the next one going around here is data. So you need to have data, clearly. Most of us today do have quite a lot of data, so it's, things have moved on a long way from 10 years ago. You need to get all of that data in one place, and as illustrated by that example of the Ocado checkout walk, your data needs to be fairly fine-grained. Having high-level aggregates, having data that doesn't let you track the customer's journey in a good way is not going to help you answer many of the questions that you want to answer. So you need to get that data, you need to store it, it needs to be in one place. It's no use having your data fragmented across lots and lots of systems. Obviously, that's easy for me to say as someone who's been in kind of fairly modern digital companies. I do appreciate those are harder tasks for companies that have come over many, many years and whose data is inherently fragmented. But unless you can get that data into one place, you're really going to struggle for those nice people. Hire great people, but if the data is spread all over the place and not very accessible, then they're going to struggle to do anything useful with it. So that's a really essential ingredient. And another point to make about the data, which actually does also apply even in the sort of modern businesses that I've been in, is it's often surprisingly hard to get the right data tracked and to have it be correct. And that's usually because the people who are producing that data, which in what is basically going to be some sort of engineer of some kind who's writing some code typically to do that tracking of data, that person very often doesn't care so much about the data. They care about the performance of their code. They care about that their code does the right thing for the customer, for the product. And for them, the tracking is something that someone else is kind of telling them to do. And they very often don't value it as much as everything else. And the immediate consequence of that, which I've observed over and over again, is that the data is wrong in various ways. The data is captured at the wrong point in the process, so what you think the data means isn't quite right because it means the action the customer was taking that you think the data represents is actually slightly wrong because this is captured at a different point in the process. The actual fields within the data, the attributes are often wrong. And so unless you can find a way... I'm going to try not moving this arm, see if that actually let me... Oh, is it? Okay, all right, thanks. Unless you can find a way around that problem, then you can have great difficulty. And I would say that's often a case, one of the few cases I would say, where you really do need just sort of high-level executive sponsorship to make it clear that that is an essential ingredient and that people do need to produce the right data. I'll come a bit later to sort of team structure, and there are some things that you can do to help improve that. But it's definitely something that does often need to be kind of mandated from on high. Now, finally, the third portion here is systems. Obviously, the data needs to go into some great high-performance data systems. When your data systems are not performant enough, then that puts a massive slowdown on the whole process. And, well, it prevents lots of things from being done. The sort of rate of kind of exploration and insight you can get from the data can be slowed a lot. It also means that your people get really annoyed and they maybe want to go and work in a different company where they can do their job more easily. So having the right systems is a really essential ingredient. When I mentioned a few minutes back about the crazy growth that we went through at King, that was one thing that really suffered. So going from a few million to a few hundred million customers, we were struggling even to get basic daily reporting out on time each morning. And that meant trying to get the data in a state and in systems that were performant enough for a rapidly growing team of analysts and data scientists to make good use of it was kind of taking second tier to that. And so that was a real struggle for a while. Obviously today there's a great choice of systems out there, from stuff, loads and loads of cloud options, loads and loads of sort of in-house possibilities as well. So in some sense the toolkit is ever brighter in that area. And so something that one should have fewer excuses today than we had then, even though I didn't think we had very many excuses back then either. So it's definitely, those are the three key ingredients to pull together. So once you've got those three ingredients together, then you want to get started. Getting started is really about finding some quick wins. And these can be really quite simple things. Take some key business metrics that you really care about. Obviously, there's a huge range of different industries represented in the room here, so it's hard for me to be at all specific about that. Obviously, all of us care about things like customer acquisition and lifetime value, but it's very often easier to get started in simpler stuff around your operational metrics. And the key thing there is to sort of identify pain points. So in all of these metrics, if you've got that fine-grained data, you can very, very quickly move away from averages. So averages hide the interesting stuff. And so the moment you can move away from an average and dig into it and break it down by different customer types, by different product types, by different parts of the business, you can see, you can see that variation, and immediately things leap out. You don't need great statistical sophistication or anything like that. It's just kind of basic stuff. Look at the distributions of your metrics, and you'll see that certain days of the week or certain customers or certain products are outliers and are much more negative or positive than the average, and that then leads you on a journey. And so that's, that path is something that works really, really well. Let me give you a simple example of this, again from Ocado, and this was around product damages. So at that stage, Ocado was delivering something of the order of 1 to 1.2 million individual items per day. And it's probably about double, 2 to 3 times that today. So all of those items are delivered to customers, and then customers request a refund on some of those for various reasons, but the most common reason is that the product has been damaged. So obviously we wanted to understand what's causing this damage, what can we do to try and reduce this, both obviously because it's a cost for Ocado's business, and it's really annoying for the customer. The whole point of online grocery shopping is it makes your life easier, and then if some key things that you wanted are overly damaged, then you've got to go to the shop anyway. So that's really undermines the whole business. So the question is, what are the possible causes of product damage? It can obviously be the journey to the customer's house, which if the journey is particularly long, then that might be problematic. If maybe there's different kinds of drivers, some drivers are maybe a bit more Formula One style and other drivers are a bit more relaxed, that could be an issue. It's also the warehouse process of getting the product and putting it in the customer's tote. So what happened in that process? Was it something that was picked very early on in the process, and so that product was riding around in the customer's tote for a long time in the warehouse, or was it picked right towards the end? Who picked it? So those are the general factors that kind of come into it. There's also a loading process, so the tote then needs to be loaded from the warehouse into a rack, and the rack needs to go in the van. I suppose one other ingredient is what product is the customer, what other products is that particular item in the bag with? So when things are packed, you don't want to put, a melon in with your eggs, for example. And so, actually, we built algorithms to not do that, but it may be that something went wrong there. So, to cut a long story short, a very straightforward analysis of, here are millions and millions of products that have been delivered over months and months. We've got many, many hundreds of thousands of items that have been refunded, and what do they correlate with? A few surprising things leapt out there. There were some things that were not surprising. Indeed, some drivers were more correlated with product damage than others. Although you've got to be a little bit careful with that because some drivers may work in areas where the routes are longer, where maybe the roads are more bumpy for some reason. So you need to be a little bit careful about pinning the blame on the driver as opposed to the circumstance they're in. And indeed, some of the people loading the racks were also more strongly correlated with damage. But the most interesting thing that leapt out was that there were 3 individuals in the warehouse who had like 20 times more damage associated with them than anyone else. So these were people who were supposedly picking product, putting it in the bag, and they got 20 times more damage than everyone else. So, very, very surprising. What are they doing? But the answer turned out to be very, very simple. Well, first confusing and then very simple. These people were actually not people who were picking in the warehouse. They were actually the managers of the picking warehouse setup. And so they're not supposed to be doing much picking at all, really. Sometimes they'll fill in, but not much. But then digging a bit deeper, obviously you've got to go and talk to people, find out what's going on. It turned out that these people were responsible. One of the things that they did was if one of the customers' totes was running late in the warehouse, it would go down a special side conveyor belt, and they were responsible for scanning that at the end of that conveyor belt and taking it to the correct rack and putting it in to kind of do a shortcut in the process. And what they were doing was actually 100% fine. The problem was this conveyor belt, where the last section of it is what is euphemistically called a gravity conveyor, which is basically a big slide with a wall at the end of it. So these totes were zooming down, crashing into the wall, and that was what was causing this crazy amount of product damage. And so, very simple solution in the end to change this gravity conveyor to something that was a little bit more delicate for the products. So, that's an example of the kind of stuff where you don't need sophistication, you don't need crazy machine learning and all this stuff. You just need diligent scientists who want to understand what's going on and have the data and the people at their fingertips so that they can get those things answered. And it all starts by just taking an average and unpinning that average into the distribution and then looking at the strange outliers. And that process I've repeated over and over again over the years through both King and Deliveroo with tremendous outcomes. All right, let's move on to the next stage. So we've gone through that example. And so the main course, impact. So how do we get serious impact? And there's a few different, I've given one example already, but there's a few different things I wanted to point out which are things that kind of end up stopping such teams from having impact. So one of these is what I'll call the endless reporting treadmill. And this is perhaps one of the hardest things to avoid. Alongside, every business wants some standard reporting available, and there's great tools for this. There's, historically things like Tableau, MicroStrategy, ClickView. More recently, tools like Looker have emerged on the scene. They're all fantastic kind of BI reporting tools. And you tend to end up in this process where, okay, the business needs some data. Actually, that's the wrong starting point. Business people want to make some decisions. They don't really know quite what data they need, how they can best make the decision, so they ask for some reports that contain a whole bunch of stuff, sliced and diced by country and market and product and whatever. And neither does your sort of BI team. They don't really know yet what it is that's the best way to kind of help these people make decisions. So the BA team, the business people ask for all these nice reports with lots of charts and graphs, which are all kind of very generic. And the BI team produces those, and the business people start to get some value from that, and they start to help them make decisions. And pretty soon you end up in this kind of feedback loop where business people have trained themselves to just ask for lots and lots of graphs and charts and tables of data. And the BI team have been trained that that's what everyone wants, and they seem to get some value from it, so let's produce it. And all kind of intelligence has been removed from the process. And you end up with a place with 300 reports, just endless reports in your chosen BI tool of choice, and it becomes hard to find anything even. And then you start going through a process of, okay, which ones of these are actually used anymore? Let's start getting rid of some, and at that point, you're way too far down the process. But it's a very seductive process because each step seems to make sense. But you need to find a way to kind of interrupt that cycle and work out, okay, once we've begun to learn about what matters here, then what we want is not graphs and charts and tables of data. We want the specific things that help us take the important decisions. So you need to pause and stop within that process very often to reassess and say, okay, you've produced all this great stuff. We now understand what it is that we're trying to do here. Let's throw away that stuff and put in place exactly the right, insightful few graphs or charts or tables that let me take the decisions that I want. But it's a really hard problem to avoid. And certainly fallen into that one on a couple of occasions. All right, so the next point is about data science and analytics and actionable insight. So part of this is about getting the right people. But I think lots of people talk about actionable insight, and obviously the key word in there is action, is taking some action. And so how... if you've got a data scientist or some other analyst sitting there trying to do something, how is it that their work is going to lead to some action down the line? And the more obstacles that are in the place of that, the less likely it is that any meaningful impact is going to come out of that process. And so, as much as possible, obviously you've got to have the right people there, but they need to be enabled to take action. So that means they need to be probably embedded in the portion of the business that they're trying to work with and help at least. They shouldn't be some kind of central team of data scientists or analysts. You want people embedded in there. And that team, and I'll come later more into details about how to organize a team, but that team needs to have the resources and capabilities within it that it can actually act upon things. Again, this is obviously slightly easier in the purely digital world, although even then it's hard. It means you need teams that have the back-end engineers, the front-end engineers, the designers, the user experience people. You need all of that group in one team so that you can go from analysis, idea, execution, impact in that one group without getting anyone else involved. But there's many ways in which analytics work ends up not having any impact, and that's just sort of your business will have its own obstacles in the way, and I would just urge you to find ways to remove them because there's often endless obstacles in the way, and that's a very sort of unimpactful process in the end. The other key thing to think about here is really understanding what are the levers that you've got your hands on. So in all businesses, there's dozens and dozens of things that could be improved or changed, and which of those are ones that have a chance of having a big impact, and which of them, even if you made dramatic improvements to them, are actually still only going to have a small impact to your high-level metrics that you care about. So one of the things that we did just over the last few weeks at Deliveroo is we did a very simple set of back-of-envelope calculations of all of the different levers across the business. If we could improve new customer acquisition by a few percent, what would that do? If we could improve retention by a few percent, what would that do? And kind of working through all of those metrics. And it was a really insightful exercise because we realized that actually there were a couple of teams who were working on stuff that was actually not really in the top few areas. So they were working on things which, were great, would improve the metrics that they were looking at by, if they came up with great stuff, would improve those by a significant margin, but those would, the trickle-through effect on, revenue or profit or whatever was going to be tiny compared with other things they could be doing. So that really led to a kind of reassessment of what was important stuff to focus on. And so, again, being able to focus your attention on the important stuff requires people to really understand the business, product, and customer very, very well. And And the third key thing I want to say in this area is about experimentation. So, so you want to do lots and lots of experimentation, and that experimentation should be good experimentation in the sense that it's targeted at a potentially high-impact area. But also, when we're in businesses that deal with customers, as in people, people behave in all sorts of very surprising, interesting, unclear ways. And so you will not know up front which of the actions, which of the experiments that you're interested in running, which of your ideas are genuinely going to be good or not. Most of your apparently great ideas turn out to be no good at all. And so you need to get yourself in a sort of iterating through very, very fast. And the approach that we've taken at King and Deliveroo is you want to, if you can get 10 good experiments done, 1 or 2 of them are probably going to end up actually having a fantastic positive impact on the business. And the other 8, they were great ideas, but actually you didn't understand your customer well enough. And you should learn from those other 8 because they've taught you something that you didn't know about your customer, but they have had 0 or negative impact or thereabouts, and kill those and move on. And you're not going to get away from that sort of only a couple of ideas really have impact and most of them fail. So the faster you can go around that cycle, the better. Companies like Airbnb have about 700 experiments running at any one time. In a typical week. At Deliveroo, we've probably got about 30 or 40 right now, but our ambition is to add another 0 to the end of that. And it's that sort of fast-paced iteration that really lets you capture good things. All right, I'm going to skip over that example, actually, and move to... So 2 quick things I want to cover and then wrap up. So there's dangers in certain areas, and so I'm going to slightly controversially say that real-time analytics, predictive analytics are very often dead ends. So there's loads of buzz around these things, and everyone wants to do them, but very often they're not a great idea. And so let me just give you a quick run through in the case of predictive analytics why more often than not this ends up not being stunningly helpful. So to do predictive analytics, you need to build a predictive model. So you need to be able to model people and predict them. That's hard because people are not very predictable. So you need to build that predictive model. And so let's say churn prediction is one that most of us sort of think about. It's the archetypal example. We get a bunch of data. We try and predict who's going to churn and who's not. We build that model. It looks great. We then think, OK, how are we going to be able to take action on this? And then we look at the model, and it says, the predictions it makes of people who are going to churn are very often, because of the way we've structured that problem, people who've basically already churned in the past. And it's not so much a forward-looking prediction as a kind of statement of fact that we haven't really seen these people for 2 weeks. They're kind of gone. So you need to reassess that predictive model and make it one that you can actually take action upon. So, are you going to see that customer again? That makes the prediction even harder. So your first step's even harder now. But let's say you've gone down the prediction. You've now got an opportunity to act. The customer's on your website or in your app, and you're pretty sure you're not going to be seeing them again. What can you do that's actually going to make them really happy with your service again? It's kind of too late. There's very little you can do, in my experience, that actually has any meaningful effect on their behavior. Not 0 effect, but nothing very meaningful. And so really the thing you need to do is not have clever machine learning predictive analytics. It's look further upstream and say, oh, here's some customers who used to be good users of my service. Their use of my service is declining over time. I'm worried that in a few months' time they might churn, but I need to do something now to engage them again with my service. And that doesn't need any clever predictive analytics or any real-time stuff. That just needs some common sense and experimentation. Don't go overboard with predicting stuff. Try instead act in advance. OK, just 2 minutes on the last thing, scale. So I mentioned I've learned a lot of difficult things around scaling these teams. So here's a typical path. So when you start out, you've got very few people. You know, it's certainly at Ocado and at King, there were just sort of 5 people, so it was one small team. And then we kind of grew. And the natural thing to do is to have a number of functional teams. So you have your BI reporting team. You've got a little team of data scientists. You've got some data engineers, which begin to separate out into their sub-teams. Sounds great. And then if you make a bad mistake, you end up going to this next thing, where you've got even more functional separation. And now the question you have to ask yourself is, when something needs to get done, and there's a business need, how many teams are going to have to touch that and do work on it? And how many iterations are going to have to pass back and forth? So you need some new reporting, but that reporting is going to require some data engineering down here, some changes to the data model, and maybe there's some analytics that needs to go into it. And so that, what was apparently a simple piece of work, is bouncing back and forth between several teams. And in my experience, many things can take like 6 months for something that is apparently really simple. So do not move to that step here. It's a bad idea. Leapfrog that, and as much as possible, go to what's on the right there. So, as much as possible, embed individuals in your business units, product units, whatever they may be, and sometimes embed whole entire sub-teams. So, at King, we tried out many things and eventually decided, okay, this portion of the business, we should have some data scientists, some BI reporting people, and some data engineers who work purely for them. So, anything that they need can get done. They can understand that portion of the business much better as well, of course. And then, that 6-month development cycle actually would drop to just a few weeks with better outcomes. So, that's absolutely key, I would say. The speed with which you want to go about embedding people in different parts of the organization may be different for different portions of this. So there's no kind of one-size-fits-all here. But do try and get cross-functional teams as much as possible, and the speed of execution is just going to be so much faster. With that, I will wrap up.